Hi, this is Fidemaster Viktor Neustroyev. Everyone likes to attack. Even if an immediate attack is the wrong plan, many chess players still prefer to use it. In these cases, the attack may result in several weaknesses in your own camp, so your opponent can take the advantage of it. How to define whether you should attack the enemy king or not? Well, there are several factors to take into account, and I'm going to share them with you. Another good question is how exactly to attack? How to expose the enemy king? Should I initiate a pawn march, attack with the edge pawn, or only minor and major pieces? And how to join the rooks into the attack? This is what chess players usually struggle with. I'm going to answer all these questions in this video. Okay, let's discuss when and how to attack in a chess game. First of all, in order to attack, there should be two preconditions in the position. If at least one of them doesn't exist, your attack is likely to fail. They are the following. The center should be closed or stable, so your opponent wouldn't open the position in the center and obtain a counterplay. You should have the material majority on the side where the enemy king is located. Or at least you see how you can bring more pieces into the attack and achieve this material majority. Actually, material majority is not required in case if the enemy king is compromised, or what means exposed. Now, let's define how exactly to attack in three different types of the positions. For example, when on the same castle positions, on the opposite castle positions, and when the enemy king is in the center. So this diagram represents how to attack when the kings are castled to the same side. Black just played rook to c8, hoping to achieve some counterplay on the queen side, but what do you think white should do? It's a very typical idea, which you probably have heard, rook lift, rook f3. With this move, they activate the rook and bring more pieces into the attack. In the game, it was king h8, which is maybe not the best move. The next move is f6, with the idea to expose the king, to compromise it, so to create weaknesses and make it easier to attack. For example, if now pawn to g6, white has queen c1 and enter to the enemy camp h6 and so on. Let me show you. a5, let's say, I don't know which move they can play. Queen h6, threatening with the mate on g7. If rook g8, here you can checkmate in two moves. Did you find it? If not, this is the answer. Rook sacrifice, and then because of this rook lift you checkmate. Of course, rook lift is not the only idea. Sometimes, especially when the pawn is on g6, you can apply the idea of the attack of the edge pawn, especially if you have a light square bishop. But let's go back and talk about what happened in the game. G took on f6. Here I also want you to notice that the center is stable and black cannot do anything to open it. Queen h4, threatening to play rook h3 and deliver a checkmate on h7, so they have to play rook g8. Knight takes f6, threatening with a mate, so they either have to take and stay under a pin, or play rook g7 right away. Now we exchange defensive pieces of black, rook g3. And if now rook takes rook, it's a checkmate on h7. That's why in the game, black decided to take the knight. No, actually, at the moment, you are threatening with this move, then rook h7 and rook g8 mate, so they had to play something, and they chose bishop f6. After that, they are under a pin. However, you cannot gain the material right away. What do you think white should do next? Well, of course, the answer is easy, to join the other rook into the game, or at least get more pieces into the game. How? Well, now, while these pieces have to stay on the g file to protect on g7, you can just enter the enemy camp through the center. Then you capture the pawn on the d file and successfully checkmate using the back rank or gain the enemy queen. So here, when you realize the center is stable, you may allow yourself to initiate the attack, especially if you see that many of your pieces can join this attack, and you also see the way of how to get rid of the enemy king's pawn cover. And now the second type of the positions, when both players are castled to the opposite sides. Here, white castle to the queen side, black castle to the king side. So what do you think white should do in order to create an attack of the enemy king? The most common plan is to initiate a pawn march, because when you push the pawns, this time you don't weaken your king because your king is located on the other side. That's why here it's either g4 with the idea of g5 or rook to g1 and then g4 if you don't want to sacrifice the pawn. However, you may sacrifice because your plan is to open the files to join your rooks into the attack. Here, if you play g4, you intend to play g5 and open the f and the h files to use your rooks. And if they capture on g4, then you open the g file. Queen g2 was played in the game. Well, in this position, black could continue with e5, but it opens our bishop, and after knight f5, white still has a strong potential for their attack. That's why black retreated with knight f6. Rook g1, adding more pressure on g7. Bishop d7 is a helpful move, and then let's use our light squared bishop and open it with f5. Then king h8 was played as a prophylaxis, but we also activate the other rook. So the key idea here is to open both files to pressure the king and the pieces that defends, for example, the g7 square. If we can somehow capture on f8 with our rook, then we can checkmate on g7. Queen goes back to the defense, f takes e6, f takes e6, and now we see that we don't have pieces to finish our attack successfully. That's why let's join it. If we can get rid of this knight, then rook f8 leads to a checkmate. That's why e5, and after d takes e5, knight e4, distracting it. So knight takes here, rook f8, rook takes f8, queen g7 is a checkmate. That's why black plays knight h5 to protect here, but the knight on h5 is the object of the attack. Queen g6. And after they take on d4, you can successfully play knight g5 in order to open the h file. So here white is threatening with a checkmate, and black has to take queen h5, king g8, queen f7, king to h8, and then a rook lift wins the game. Well, of course, they can first play g4, but doesn't really matter. Then, for example, you can continue with rook f5, because if now the pawn takes, it's queen h5 mate, and nothing can stop rook h5, for example, in this concrete position. So from this game, you may learn that the main task is to open the files, to be able to use more pieces, especially your rooks, to attack the enemy king and to destroy the pieces that are protecting weaknesses near the enemy king. And the pawn march is a good way to achieve it. Now, if you look at this position, white just castled and black gets their king in the center. So how should we exploit this advantage? Well, white is better developed, and if possible, white should try to open the position. So here black, for example, decided to capture the pawn on c3. But here, if possible, again, you should use the pawns to get rid of the central pawn. So if the pawn was on f5, it would be great. You could open up the position and then try to attack the king with your pieces. However, if you have the advantage in development, and it usually happens when the enemy king is in the center, you may even sacrifice pieces. For example, like Mikhail Tal did in this game, he played knight f5. Well, this sacrifice should be accepted, otherwise the knight jumps to d6. E takes f5, rook e1 check, so the king is exposed. These pieces are not participating in the game. Bishop e6, queen d6, they tried to do something like x6, but now the queen becomes the object of the attack, and white just remaneuvers their pieces to take the advantage of the enemy king's weakness. Bishop b4 threatening with queen e7 and queen f8. Now, this is the main threat at the moment. So 8 takes b5 was played in the game, and now queen f8 taking the other rook. And in this position, black just resigned, because they cannot develop these pieces, the king is exposed, and it's just a matter of time. For example, it could be played queen e4, let's say, bishop d6, king comes there, queen e8, and in this position, well, rook c1 with bishop c5 leads to a checkmate, so I believe the best move is to sacrifice the queen, and of course you understand white is winning. So when you see that the enemy king is uncastled and you are well developed and you want to take the advantage of your better development, you may expose the enemy king, and sometimes you may even sacrifice the material. If you sacrifice the pawn, it's good, but if you sacrifice a minor piece, I kindly recommend you to calculate the line properly. In this video you learned when you can initiate the attack and 3 typical plans of how exactly to attack depending on the enemy king's position. I'm sure this knowledge will help you a lot to succeed in attacking and will improve your chess performance. Thank you for watching, and make sure to like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel and share it with your friends, chess players, so they can learn these typical plans as well. Proper attack is always good, but how to play when your opponent starts the attack and you have to defend your position? Don't worry, there are several ways of how to parry enemy threats, and if you want to learn them, watch the video how to defend in a chess game and avoid getting a checkmate on the screen next, and I will see you there in a moment.